This is Oral Rehab Lecture 5, Part 3, continuing a presentation on psychosocial consequences of hearing loss. And in Part 3, we return to our discussion of adults with adult onset hearing loss. Again, I'll remind you that many of the articles that you have will provide you with much both detail and nuance of the sorts of problems and the sorts of changes that hearing impairment imposes on persons. In this particular screencast, I'm focusing on generally a description of the kinds of problems and the kind of descriptors that adults with adult onset hearing loss tend to have. Sort of the model that I'm using to kind of go through aligns with one of your readings anyway, which is an article by A2, 1996. A2 and his colleague Gagné, and you have an article by Jean-Pierre Gagné, are Canadians, and their work as oral rehabilitationists was featured mostly in populations of workers, and in fact this one framework that I'm presenting to you is based on sort of focus groups and interviews with workers from a noisy bottling plant experience and their spouses. So the workers primarily males, middle-aged to older males, working in a highly noisy environment that was damaging to their hearing. And so I think the scientific work that was done in this area was, again, can be credited to A2. Gagné references the A2 work and kind of summarizes it at least. So, but I thought I'd give you just a little bit more treatment of it in this slide set. Again, I'm going to lead you to a general set of descriptors is the general idea here. So, all right. So, first step off point here is that persons who were around a lot of noise, or been around a lot of noise in their life, are going to have hearing impairment. That's really not the issue, is whether they have hearing impairment or not. The problem is that they fail or are reluctant to acknowledge that the hearing impairment they have causes them any hearing difficulties. Again, the general idea of what we're going to describe here as a general descriptor of persons with hearing loss, PWHI, persons with hearing impairment, is that they're in denial, that they just refuse to accept that they have any problems, even though they would likely say, oh yeah, I've got a hearing loss, but I don't have any problems. Again, they would say that, yeah, their condition is certainly due to the fact that, well, they are older, they are working in a background of noise, in their working conditions or previous experiences. So yeah, they're not going to deny that they're in a situation where they could be damaged by noise exposure and have hearing loss. But what they're saying is that they don't have any problems, and any hearing problems that they in fact would have are of no consequence. That's denial. So this is what we're talking about when we think about denial, is that the person just refuses to accept that they have any problems, when in fact, you know, as professionals, we would have a sense that the loss of hearing that they would have and the loss of information that they are experiencing would tend to be problematic for them. But they say no. Another manifestation of denial was, and again, what A2 did was he had focus groups between workers and their spouses, and found that in the stories between the workers versus the spouses were very different. Inconsistencies, discrepancies in terms of problems. If you look in the Scow and Nurbin book, the Scow and Nurbin book has in chapter 10 has the sac and has the soak, and I don't know whether the sac and soak actually was before this, and the sac is self-assessment of communication, and this soak is a significant other assessment of communication. So this was a kind of has the capacity to come up with discrepancies in terms of communication performance. So anyway, so denial is just this general sense that we don't really have a problem. So the question would be, the correct question would be, well, why would somebody be reluctant to acknowledge that they have a problem? Why would they be in a state of denial? And the usual explanation is that it's due to stigma. Notice here, spelled correctly. Your slide said I spelled it incorrectly. So you see the Gagne article, see the Ross article on stigma and self-stigma. And so the general description of stigma is it's an attribute that makes a person perceive that they're an outsider. So again, stigma is sort of is an attribute of a person, but it also is an interaction between that person and society, and what society values or what society sees as beneficial sort of attributes. And so again, the notion of stigma in sort of in a general sense might have been sort of a physical marking or a physical attribute that society sort of has decided, from societal value kind of perspective, is unattractive or unwanted. So the point, I guess, here is that hearing loss was shown to be sort of a cause of stigma, and therefore denial is a natural response to being stigmatized. So rather than being stigmatized, they just deny that there's a problem. Gagne also talks about the notion of self-stigma. Self-stigma would be self-induced, because hearing loss is an invisible condition, meaning for the most part there is no physical, visually identifiable characteristics of hearing loss, at least not universally, and not in the majority of cases. So the person with hearing loss can choose or not to disclose that they have a condition to whoever they want to. Now, the argument always would be, and Ross, in his article about stigma, Ross makes the point that if you're around anybody with hearing loss, you certainly would know that they do have hearing loss. But this is kind of in the mindset or the perceptual mindset of the person with hearing loss. Because hearing loss is this invisible condition, the person can choose not to disclose it. The process of lack of disclosure itself is stressful, because again, the person is basically hiding or attempting to hide a secret. That is to say that they have this hearing impairment and some certain difficulties, but they don't want to admit to it because they don't want to be stigmatized. And so that has a consequence of additional stress on the person. It causes them to have other experiences of shame, decreased self-esteem, decreased self-efficacy. If you read some of the example points of, and Gagne brings up a point, I think it's in the Gagne article, it's that he says that someone who said, well, we think you're going to need hearing aids, and he said, the person responded like, as if he said he needed to wear adult diapers. I mean, that's the extent of self-esteem that the notion of hearing aids associated in one person's mind anyway showed how less self-esteem that they would feel that they would have if they had to wear a hearing aid. So this notion of self-stigma is, again, their perception that they would be relegated to outsider status, that they'd be relegated to less than ideal participant in society. In Atou's work, this reluctance had several sorts of aspects. There was a general minimization of the problems that the person has. The person with hearing loss compares himself to his peers and says, "Hey, look at me. I'm better than that guy over there. So therefore, my problem is somewhat minimal because that guy's got it worse." That notion is called minimization. We talk about minimization. Generally, you could say, "Well, this problem only affects the people around me. It's really not that big of a deal." Again, it's minimization. And as well, showing that I can overcome these consequences, or that I can cope with it. Yeah, there might be some problems occasionally, but I can handle it, I can deal with it. All of these are minimization kind of strategies. The spouse also engages in some minimization, and we could also call that, in some respects, you could also call that enabling. enabling behaviors, may not be spelling it correctly, but in enabling behaviors, the spouse would also participate in minimization. Say, well, yeah, it only happens infrequently, and it really doesn't bother me. There might be some other reasons. Well, we live under where airplanes are flying. All kinds of stuff. Oh yeah, I do have to do some things so that I can communicate with him. But all of that really doesn't bother me. It doesn't really take any effort for me to compensate for my hearing impaired spouse's hearing loss. So all of that is kind of minimization kind of behaviors. This leads to a reluctance to talk about the problem and its consequences. A2 noted that persons were impatient when they talked about hearing problems, and he sort of attributed to that they didn't want to be associated with the stigma of hearing loss. So they wanted to disassociate themselves with any sort of connection to hearing loss, because they saw it as a stigmatizing kind of condition. So in their fears and their perceived fears and problems that they did sort of admit to eventually in these focus groups, they, again, primarily feared being stigmatized. They thought that by admitting to having hearing loss, it would lead to reduced job opportunities, especially regarding promotion and other job opportunities that they may have, and fueled by the sense that even when other people knew about it, it didn't really help them at all. So there was no benefit to them in acknowledging, because it didn't help their interactions with people. So why bother telling people that you got a problem? The consequences of all this turn out to be a failure to disclose or outwardly acknowledge hearing loss. For these workers, it led to a tendency to self-isolate. For these workers, they would eat alone at lunch. They would not participate in family or work-related social events. Again, they would go to what we led off this lecture in terms of self-isolation and social isolation. In this case, it was self-imposed, but nonetheless it was social isolation, because it's just too hard and too stressful to admit being a person with hearing loss. On that, I'm going to adjourn, and we'll get to part 4.